The darkness outside the viewport seemed deeper than usual as Lieutenant Kael Ardent stared into it. She-12 was a lonely planet, orbiting a sun so faint that its light barely illuminated the rocky terrain below. The holographic display in front of him blinked with the stark insignia of the Alliance Command as Admiral Renek's voice, sharp and clinical, filled the small confines of the dropship's cockpit. "Lieutenant Ardent, you have your orders," Renek intoned. "The colony on She-12 has failed to respond to communications for 96 days. Initial reports suggest the possibility of hostile biological contamination. Your mission is to assess the situation, determine the scope of the threat, and, if necessary, execute Protocol Zero. I trust I don't need to remind you of the gravity of this directive." Kael nodded, though Renek couldn't see him. His jaw tightened at the mention of Protocol Zero. It was the last resort, the nuclear option for missions where the survival of a threat outweighed the value of human life. Entire planets had been wiped clean under its authority. The mere suggestion of it meant whatever had happened on She-12 was worse than Command wanted to admit. "Yes, sir," Kael replied. His voice betrayed none of the unease twisting in his gut. "You are authorized for full operational control. Eliminate any data breaches and ensure no contaminated material escapes the planet. Failure is not an option." The transmission ended with a cold hiss, and Kael was left with the oppressive silence of the cockpit. Below him, She-12 loomed, its surface obscured by thick, swirling fog that glimmered faintly, as if alive. His crew sat behind him in the cramped troop bay, their voices low as they prepared for deployment. Kael turned his seat to face them. They were a small squad, 4 soldiers, each handpicked for missions where survival wasn't guaranteed. "Listen up," he began, his voice steady. "You've all seen the brief. No communications from She-12 for 3 months. The colony was classified as a mining outpost, but we've learned it was also a research facility. Command thinks they might have dug up something they shouldn't have." "What kind of something?" asked Corporal Vance, the team's medic. His face was pale in the dim light, and Kael could see the tension in his clenched fists. "We don't know," Kael admitted. "That's why we're here. But Command doesn't send Protocol Zero orders for nothing. We're treating this like a worst-case scenario. Full contamination protocols. No touching anything unless it's absolutely necessary. Clear?" The squad nodded, though the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Sergeant Nira, the team's weapons specialist, leaned forward, her dark eyes narrowing. "And if we find survivors?" she asked. Kael hesitated. The idea of survivors hadn't crossed his mind. The silence from the colony wasn't just ominous, it was final. Still, he needed to maintain hope, even if only to keep his team focused. "If there are survivors, we extract them," he said. "But let's be realistic. We're probably dealing with bodies, or worse." Nira nodded grimly, her question answered. The dropship shuddered as it hit the planet's atmosphere, the vibrations rattling through Kael's bones. The ship's autopilot guided them toward the colony's coordinates, descending through the thick fog that coated She-12 like a second atmosphere. The sensors flickered erratically, struggling to make sense of the interference. "What the hell is this?" muttered Private Dren, the youngest of the team, as he peered out the viewport. The fog shimmered in strange, iridescent colors, shifting in unnatural patterns. It looked almost alive. "Focus," Kael barked, though he felt the same unease. "Stay sharp. We land. We secure the area, we figure out what happened. The dropship touched down with a metallic clang, the landing gear sinking slightly into the soft, spongy ground. Kyle donned his helmet and activated the HUD, scanning the area. The colony's buildings were visible through the fog, tall, angular structures that seemed eerily intact. There were no signs of life, no movement. "All right, move out," Kael ordered, leading the squad down the ramp. Their boots squelched against the ground, which felt unnervingly pliant beneath their feet. The air was thick, carrying a faint, acrid smell that stung Kael's nostrils even through his helmet's filters. "Doesn't look abandoned," Vance said, his voice crackling through the comms. "Lights are out, but the structures are intact. No signs of battle." "No signs of anything," Nira added, her rifle sweeping across the mist-shrouded landscape. "No bodies, no equipment, not even tracks. It's like they all just vanished." Kyle didn't reply. Something about the silence pressed against him, suffocating. He felt as if they were being watched, though every scan came up empty. The team approached the colony's main hub, a large, domed building that served as its command center. The doors were slightly ajar, and Kyle's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave and report the mission as a loss. But he pressed forward. The mission came first. Inside, the hub was dark, the air stale. Their flashlights illuminated a scene of chaos. Furniture lay overturned, terminals smashed, and walls smeared with a dark, viscous substance that glistened in the light. The stench was overpowering, a nauseating mix of rot and something metallic. "Jesus," muttered Dren, his voice trembling. "What happened here?" Kael ignored him, moving deeper into the hub. His HUD picked up faint heat signatures ahead, small, erratic, like flickers of a dying fire. He gestured for the squad to follow, their weapons raised. The source of the heat signatures was a pile of organic matter, tangled and pulsating faintly. Kyle's stomach churned as he realized what it was. Fragments of human bodies fused together in a mass of sinew and bone. Faces stared up at him, their expressions frozen in agony. "What the hell is that?" Vance whispered, backing away. "Stay focused," Kyle ordered, though his voice betrayed his fear. "We need to find the command logs. Whatever this is, it didn't happen overnight." They pressed on, deeper into the hub, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. In the command center, Kael found a working terminal. The logs were fragmented, corrupted, but what little he could access chilled him to the core. Experiment 17 successful, integration rate exceeding projections. Host viability, adapting to... The log cut off abruptly, replaced by static and a high-pitched screech. Another log appeared, showing a scientist's face, pale, sweating, eyes wide with terror. "We thought we could control it. We thought..." The log ended as the screen distorted, the scientist's face melting into a blur. Kael turned to his team, his heart pounding. "We're not alone here," he said. "Stay close. Whatever they found, it's still out there." For the first time in his career, Kael wondered if the mission was even survivable. Kyle stepped into the colony's central hub, the air heavy with a smell that clung to the back of his throat. It wasn't just decay, it was something deeper, more alien. The dim light from his helmet illuminated the room ahead. Tables lay overturned, monitors were smashed, and the walls bore streaks of something dark and viscous. Vance, behind him, paused. "Lieutenant, is that blood?" Kael crouched to examine the streaks. It wasn't blood, not entirely. The substance had a shimmer to it, as though flecks of metal or something organic had been mixed into the liquid. He touched it with his gloved hand and it clung to his fingertips, almost as if resisting. "Not blood," Kael muttered, standing. He shook off the substance, watching as it slithered off his glove like liquid mercury. "Stay sharp. Something isn't right." The team advanced cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the dim haze. The walls were scarred with deep gouges, not random marks, but deliberate, almost patterned, as though something had been dragged across them again and again. "This wasn't just a panic," Sergeant Nira said, her voice low. "Something tore this place apart." Kael led them to the control room. Unlike the rest of the hub, this room was largely intact. Terminals flickered weakly, their screens marred with static and corrupted data. Kael moved to the central console, his fingers gliding over the interface as he tried to bring up the colony's records. Behind him, Dren and Nira stood guard at the door, their weapons trained on the shadows. Vance muttered nervously, his gaze darting to every dark corner of the room. "Got something," Kael said, his voice drawing their attention. A series of logs appeared, flickering as if the system itself were alive and reluctant to share. He played the first recording, and the room filled with the voice of a scientist, tired, trembling, and desperate. "Log 45B. We didn't mean for this to happen. It wasn't supposed to go this far." A loud crash interrupted the voice, followed by frantic shouting in the background. Kael froze, straining to catch the words. "They're changing. It's not just the host, it's everything." The voice grew fainter as the recording descended into static. The next log appeared, this one showing a flickering hologram of the same scientist. Her face was gaunt, eyes wide with terror. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly as she spoke. "We were wrong. We thought we could contain it, but it's beyond us. It's not a parasite. It's not an infection. It's..." She faltered, swallowing hard before continuing. "It's symbiotic. It doesn't just consume, it integrates. The hosts don't die. They become part of it." The recording cut out with a deafening screech. Kael turned to the others, his gut churning. "Symbiotic," he repeated under his breath. What the hell were they trying to do here? As they moved deeper into the hub, the signs of something unnatural grew more obvious. The walls were no longer just streaked with the viscous substance. They pulsed faintly, as though alive. Vein-like tendrils stretched across the floor, twitching as if responding to their presence. "I don't like this," Vance muttered, his weapon raised. This isn't just biology. It's like the colony's part of it now." Kael didn't respond. He kept his focus ahead, leading them into a lab where rows of glass chambers lined the walls. Each chamber contained something horrifying, human forms, twisted and misshapen, suspended in thick, amber-colored fluid. Nira stepped closer to one of the chambers, her breath hitching. "Are those colonists?" The figure inside the chamber was barely recognizable as human. Its body had elongated unnaturally, its arms stretched into thin, sinewy appendages that fused with the chamber's inner walls. Its face was frozen in an expression of anguish, its mouth stretched open as though caught in a silent scream. The worst part was its eyes. They moved, following Nira as she stepped back in horror. "They're alive," Vance said, his voice barely a whisper. Kael scanned the room, his mind racing. They weren't just experimenting on the alien organism, they were experimenting on themselves. He approached a terminal near the chamber, its interface half-functional. Data logs flashed across the screen, detailing the experiments. The scientists hadn't found the organism. They'd unearthed it during a mining operation, buried deep within the planet's crust. It had started small, infecting tools and machinery, spreading like a mold. But it had evolved rapidly, adapting to integrate with any material it touched, biological or otherwise. The logs grew darker. The scientists, desperate to control the spread, had begun testing on themselves. They believed that merging with the organism would allow them to understand it, to tame it. They were wrong. The final entry caught Kael's attention. Genesis Protocol initiated. Complete integration imminent. "Lieutenant!" Dren's shout pulled Kael from the terminal. The young private was staring at something in the corner of the room, a mass of flesh and sinew that twitched and writhed as though trying to form a shape. Before Kael could respond, the mass surged forward. It moved impossibly fast, its form shifting as it lunged at Dren. He screamed, firing wildly, but the bullets did little to slow it. The creature wrapped around his legs, its tendrils piercing through his armor with sickening squelches. "Get it off him!" Kael yelled, firing his own weapon. The shots tore through the mass, causing it to screech and writhe, but it didn't let go. Dren's screams grew more frantic as the tendrils pulled him toward the wall, where they fused seamlessly with the pulsating surface. "Help me!" Dren cried, his voice raw with terror. His flesh began to ripple and shift, his features distorting as the organism overtook him. Nira grabbed him, pulling with all her strength, but it was too late. Dren's body convulsed violently before going limp, his face merging with the wall. His eyes stared back at them, wide and unblinking, as his mouth opened in a silent scream. "Move!" Kael shouted, grabbing Nira and pulling her back. "We're getting out of here now." The team bolted from the lab, their boots pounding against the veiny, pulsating floor. The walls seemed to come alive, tendrils reaching out as though trying to trap them. "What the hell was that thing?" Vance shouted, his voice breaking. Kael didn't answer. He couldn't. Whatever was happening in this colony was beyond anything he'd ever faced. One thing was certain. They weren't dealing with survivors. They were dealing with something far worse, something alive, intelligent, and growing. As they burst into the open air, Kael glanced back at the hub. The fog seemed thicker now, almost suffocating, as though the planet itself was reacting to their presence. "We keep moving," Kael ordered, his voice steely despite the fear clawing at his chest. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The greenhouse loomed ahead, its skeletal structure barely visible through the fog. The building, once a symbol of human ingenuity, a place to grow food and sustain life on a hostile planet, now radiated an ominous energy. The glass panels reflected a faint, oily sheen, and something about the way the light shifted across them made Kael hesitate. "Greenhouse might have supplies," Nira suggested, her voice strained as she scanned the area. "Could give us a breather." Kael nodded. The team needed to regroup after Dran's death, but every instinct told him this place wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. As they stepped inside, the air hit them like a wall. Thick, humid, and reeking of decay, it clung to their skin and filled their lungs despite the filters in their helmets. The greenhouse was overgrown, but not with any plants Kael recognized. Twisted vines sprawled across the floor and ceiling, their surfaces glistening as though coated in sweat. Leaves drooped in unnatural patterns, some translucent and pulsating faintly as if blood coursed through veins beneath their surfaces. "What the hell?" Vance muttered, sweeping his flashlight over the grotesque scene. The beam landed on something that made his stomach turn. A colonist's body, at least what was left of it, was entwined in the vines. The corpse's limbs were stretched unnaturally, elongated as though they had grown into the surrounding plants. Its face was frozen in a grimace of agony, eyes wide and unseeing. Thin tendrils had burrowed into its mouth and nose, anchoring it to the ground. "They're part of it," Vance whispered. His voice trembled as he took a step back. Kael crouched beside the body, his stomach twisting. The skin had taken on a strange texture, as though bark and flesh had fused together. He reached out with his knife and sliced one of the tendrils. The body jerked violently, a spasm that sent Kael stumbling backward. "It's still alive," Nira said, her voice sharp with alarm. She raised her weapon, but Kael waved her down. "Don't," he ordered. "We don't know what'll happen if you fire." Behind them, the sound of movement made Kael spin around, his rifle raised. Something was shifting in the undergrowth, something big. The vines rustled as if in anticipation, and Kael realized they weren't just plants. They were connected to the thing moving toward them. "Eyes up," Kael barked. "We've got company." The creature emerged from the shadows, its form half hidden by the dense vegetation. It was humanoid, but only just. Its limbs were elongated and asymmetrical, its flesh a patchwork of organic material and plant-like growths. Patches of its body glowed faintly, pulsating with a sickly green light that seemed to sync with the movements of the vines around it. As it stepped closer, Kael saw its face, or what was left of it. The remnants of human features were stretched and distorted, the jaw hanging loose and lined with sharp, bone-like protrusions. One eye bulged unnaturally, while the other had been replaced entirely by a cluster of glowing, spore-like bulbs. "Hold fire," Kael commanded, his voice low. He wasn't sure what the creature would do, but he wasn't eager to provoke it. The thing tilted its head as though studying them. Its movements were jerky, its joints bending at odd angles. But there was an intelligence behind its gaze, a cruel curiosity. Vance shifted his stance and the creature's head snapped toward him with alarming speed. It opened its mouth, emitting a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the room. The vines around it responded instantly, surging toward the team like serpents. "Shoot!" Kael yelled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Gunfire erupted, the muzzle flashes illuminating the greenhouse in brief staccato bursts. Bullets tore through the creature, but instead of dropping, it writhed and twisted, its body contorting unnaturally. Where chunks of its flesh were torn away, new growths sprouted almost immediately, vines and sinew weaving together to patch the wounds. "It's not dying," Nira shouted, unloading her rifle into the creature. The rounds staggered it, but it kept coming, its long arms reaching out for them. Kael switched to incendiary rounds and fired at the base of the creature's torso. The impact set its midsection ablaze, and for the first time the thing let out a piercing shriek. It stumbled backward, thrashing as the flames spread, igniting the surrounding vines. "It's vulnerable to fire," Kael shouted. "Burn it all." As the creature fell, the vines writhed in unison, retreating into the deeper shadows of the greenhouse. The team pressed forward, setting fire to the foliage where they could. The flames revealed more horrors. Rows of colonists' bodies lined the walls, each one grotesquely fused with the plant life. Some twitched weakly, their mouths moving as though trying to speak, but no sound came. Kael felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an alien organism. It wasn't killing the colonists, it was using them. Every vine, every bulb, every grotesque appendage was part of the same network, all connected to a greater whole. "This isn't just infection," Kael said, his voice low. "It's assimilation." "What do you mean?" Vance asked, his hands trembling as he reloaded his weapon. Kael pointed to the bodies. "They're not dead. It's keeping them alive, using them to grow. Every colonist, every piece of biomass, it's all part of one organism." Nira cursed under her breath, her face pale. "And we're standing in the middle of it." The ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. Kyle's HUD lit up with warnings of seismic activity, but he knew it wasn't the planet. The organism was reacting, and it was angry. "We need to move," Kael ordered. The team fell into formation, pushing toward the exit as the vines began to close in around them. The air was thick with spores, making it harder to breathe, and the ground felt as though it might give way at any moment. The greenhouse door came into view, but it was already partially blocked by a mass of vines. Kael fired his incendiary rounds, clearing a path, and the team burst into the open air just as the greenhouse behind them collapsed in on itself. A deep, resonant sound echoed from within, like the cry of a wounded animal. Kael turned to look back, his chest heaving. The greenhouse was gone, consumed entirely by the organism. He could still hear movement within the ruins, scraping, slithering, as though the creature were regrowing itself. "This isn't a colony anymore," Nira said, her voice grim. "It's alive." Kael nodded, his mind racing. They weren't just fighting an alien organism. They were fighting the colony itself, and it wasn't done with them yet. The air in the cavern was suffocating, thick with heat and the acrid stench of decay. Kael stumbled forward, his armor battered, his helmet cracked, and his mind fraying under the weight of what he had seen. The descent into the colony's depths had stripped him of everything but his mission, one he wasn't sure he could complete anymore. Before him, in the heart of the facility, was the entity the colonists had called Genesis. It loomed like a grotesque cathedral, a mass of sinew, bone, and alien growths that pulsated with an unholy rhythm. The walls were lined with human forms, half-absorbed colonists, their faces stretched in expressions of eternal agony, their bodies fused into the living structure. Some wept silently, tears trailing down faces that were no longer their own. Others reached out, fingers elongating into tendrils that intertwined with the monstrous flesh. It was alive, sentient, and it was growing. Kael's heart thundered in his chest. His squad was gone. Nira, Vance, Dren, all consumed by the nightmare, their final screams still echoing in his ears. He was alone now, the last thread of humanity left in a place that no longer belonged to his species. He tightened his grip on the detonator in his trembling hand. Protocol 0. Activate the charges, wipe the colony clean, and ensure nothing survived to escape into the galaxy. It was simple, brutal, and final. But now, staring at the entity before him, Kael hesitated. "Kael." The voice stopped him cold. It was soft, human, familiar. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the mass of faces fused into Genesis. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it, just another cruel trick of his fractured mind. But then he saw her. Nira's face emerged from the writhing mass, her features twisted but unmistakable. Her eyes met his, and he saw something in them he hadn't expected. Clarity, awareness. You're still in there, Kael whispered, stepping closer despite himself. We're all here, she said, her voice tinged with both pain and something else. Peace. It doesn't kill, Kael. It transforms. It unites. Kael recoiled, his stomach twisting. This isn't unity, it's horror. Her expression softened, though the muscles in her face twitched unnaturally. You don't understand. None of us did, until it was too late. It's not trying to destroy us. It's trying to make us more. Behind her, the other faces began to move, mouths forming words without sound. Their eyes followed him, pleading not for release but for comprehension. The cavern pulsed in rhythm with their movements, a grotesque symphony of life and suffering. Don't you see? Nira continued. We were blind, Kael. This isn't just an organism, it's evolution. Kael shook his head violently, his grip on the detonator tightening. This isn't evolution, it's assimilation, slavery. You're not even you anymore. Her gaze hardened. And what are you? A man clinging to orders given by people who'd sacrifice you without a thought. A soldier with no purpose except to destroy what he doesn't understand. The words cut deep, but Kael refused to waver. I'm here to stop this, to make sure it doesn't spread. It doesn't want to spread, Nira said, her voice rising. It doesn't need to. It's perfect here. Everything it touches becomes part of something greater. You could be too. The tendrils near her face moved closer, as if beckoning him forward. For a fleeting moment, Kael felt the pull, the temptation, the idea of surrendering, of letting go of the pain and fear, whispered to him like a siren's song. He snapped back, gritting his teeth. I won't become that. Kael's hand hovered over the detonator as he stepped closer to the central mass. He could feel its heat, its presence, pressing against his mind. Images flooded his thoughts, visions of the colonists before the experiments, their hopes and dreams. Then the digging, the discovery, the first infections, and finally, the truth. The organism wasn't just mindless hunger. It was ancient, intelligent, and patient. It had waited for eons beneath the surface, dormant until the colonists had awakened it. It didn't see itself as an invader. To it, humanity was merely raw material, a resource to be improved, repurposed, perfected. Kael's mind reeled as the entity reached out, not with tendrils, but with thoughts. It wasn't just showing him the past, it was offering him a choice. It showed him what could be. A galaxy without war, without division, without suffering. A galaxy united under one consciousness. You can end this war here, Nira's voice echoed, though her lips no longer moved. Destroy us, and you'll only delay the inevitable. Or join us, and be part of something eternal. Kael's breathing quickened. Was it lying, manipulating him, or was it offering salvation? His finger hovered over the detonator's trigger, sweat dripping down his face. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to push the button, to finish the mission. But doubt gnawed at him. What if they were right? What if Protocol Zero wasn't the solution, but a denial of something greater? Kael closed his eyes, shutting out the faces, the voices, the overwhelming presence of Genesis. He focused on the faces of his squad, Dren consumed in terror, Vance ripped apart by vines, Nira pleading with him now to see reason. When his eyes opened, they burned with resolve. His hand steadied, and he made his choice. He pressed the detonator. The charges planted throughout the colony erupted in a chain reaction, ripping through the facility with fire and force. The cavern shook violently as flames engulfed Genesis, its tendrils thrashing in agony. The human faces screamed, their voices melding into a cacophony of pain and despair. Kael ran, his legs barely carrying him as the ground buckled and split beneath him. The fire roared like a living beast, consuming everything in its path. The tunnel leading to the surface collapsed just as he reached the dropship, throwing him against the hull. He scrambled inside, punching in the launch sequence as the ground beneath the ship fractured. The dropship rocketed into the sky, leaving the inferno behind. From orbit, Kael watched as the colony burned, the flames visible even through the dense fog. The planet's surface writhed and pulsed, as though the organism was fighting to survive. But then it stilled. The fire consumed it all, leaving nothing but ash. Kael sat in the cockpit, staring at the desolate planet below. His hands trembled, his body shaking from exhaustion and the enormity of what he had done. The voices of Genesis still echoed faintly in his mind, haunting him. What if they were right? He sent his final report to command with a single line: "Mission complete. Threat neutralized." But as the dropship drifted into the void, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't won. Genesis might be gone, but its presence lingered in his thoughts. The organism had shown him a glimpse of what could be, and he couldn't unsee it. Humanity would call him a hero, a savior. But Kael knew the truth. He hadn't destroyed a monster. He had destroyed the future. Whether it was salvation or damnation, he would never know. And that uncertainty would haunt him forever.